The Montana morning was crisp and clear as 70-year-old rancher Samuel Hart made his way to the barn to tend his cattle. It was September 1894, and Samuel had been living alone on his remote ranch for 15 years since his wife Margaret passed away. The isolation suited him fine, as he preferred the company of animals to the complications that came with human neighbors. Samuel was filling water troughs when he heard a sound that made him pause. It was soft whimpering coming from the hayloft above. Living alone had sharpened his hearing, and Samuel knew every sound his barn normally made. This was something different. Something human. Hello up there. Samuel called out in a gentle voice. I know someone is hiding in my loft. You might as well come down so we can talk face to face. The whimpering stopped, but no one appeared. Samuel climbed the wooden ladder, slowly making sure his movements were not threatening. When he reached the top, he found a sight that broke his heart. A young boy was curled up in the corner of the loft, trembling with fear and cold. The child appeared to be about 10 years old, with dark hair and clothes that had once been good quality, but were now torn and dirty. Most concerning of all, the boy was thin to the point of starvation. Easy there, son, Samuel said, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. I am not going to hurt you. When did you last eat? The boy looked up with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but only managed a hoarse whisper. 3 days ago, Mr. Samuel felt his protective instincts kick in. The same feelings he had experienced raising his own children before they grew up and moved away to California. Well, that explains why you look so peaked. Come on down to the house, and we will get some food into you. The boy hesitated, then slowly stood up. As he moved, Samuel noticed he was clutching something against his chest with both hands. Whatever. It would seem to be more precious to him than his own safety. What is your name, boy? Samuel asked as they walked toward the ranch house. Peter, sir? Peter McKenzie. The boy replied, his voice gaining strength, now that he sensed he might be safe. I have been walking for 5 days, trying to find someone who could help me. Samuel opened the door to his kitchen and gestured for Peter to sit at the wooden table. As he prepared a simple meal of bread, soup, and milk, Samuel studied the boy more carefully. Peter was clearly exhausted and malnourished, but there was intelligence in his eyes and a determination that impressed the old rancher. Peter, what are you holding there? Samuel asked as he set a bowl of hot soup in front of the hungry child. Peter looked down at the object he had been protecting so carefully. It was an envelope sealed with wax and stained with what looked like dried blood. This is a letter from Marshal Thomas McKenzie. He was my father, and they killed him for trying to do what was right. Samuel felt his blood run cold. Marshal McKenzie had been one of the most respected lawmen in Montana Territory, known for his integrity and courage. News of his death 3 weeks ago had shocked communities throughout the region. Official reports claimed he had been killed by outlaws while investigating cattle rustling. Son, are you telling me that Marshal McKenzie was your father? Samuel asked, sitting down across from Peter. Peter nodded as tears began to stream down his dirt-stained cheeks. He was not killed by cattle rustlers like everyone thinks. He was murdered because he found out about something terrible happening in our town. Something involving very important people. Samuel studied the blood-stained envelope that Peter held. What kind of terrible thing? Peter wiped his eyes with his sleeve and looked directly at Samuel. My father discovered that Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison were stealing money meant for widows and orphans. When he tried to arrest them, they had him killed and made it look like an accident. The implications of what Peter was saying hit Samuel like a physical blow. If Marshal McKenzie had indeed uncovered corruption involving the mayor and the territorial judge, the conspiracy would reach far beyond their small town of Clearwater. Peter, how do you know all this? Samuel asked. Peter carefully opened the envelope. and pulled out several sheets of paper covered with his father's careful handwriting, because he wrote it all down in this letter. Every detail of what he discovered and who was involved. He gave it to me the night before they killed him and made me promise to get it to someone honest. Samuel accepted the letter with trembling hands. As he read, his face grew darker with each revelation. Marshal McKenzie had documented a systematic scheme where Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison had been embezzling funds intended for territorial welfare programs. When families applied for assistance, their money was diverted to private accounts controlled by the corrupt officials. But the corruption went deeper than simple theft. The letter revealed that when citizens began asking questions about missing funds, they faced harassment, intimidation, and in some cases, outright violence. Marshal McKenzie had identified at least 6 suspicious deaths of people who had tried to expose the Questas conspiracy. Peter, this letter contains enough evidence to bring down some very powerful people, Samuel said, looking up from the damning document. But that also makes it extremely dangerous. These men have already killed your father to protect their secrets. Peter straightened his thin shoulders with determination that reminded Samuel of soldiers he had known during the Civil War. Mr. Hart, my father died because he believed that right was right and wrong was wrong. He told me that if anything happened to him, I should find someone brave enough to finish what he started. Samuel studied the boy's face, seeing courage that belied his young years. How did you know to come to me, Peter? Peter pulled out a smaller piece of paper from his pocket. My father wrote down your name and told me where to find you. He said Samuel Hart was a man who had fought for what was right during the war and would understand why this mattered. Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. Tom McKenzie had apparently remembered their friendship from Army days and trusted him to complete a mission that had cost the Marshal his life. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible Western stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Peter, Samuel said, his voice filled with resolve, your father was one of the finest men I ever knew. He saved my life during the Battle of Antietam, and I never had the chance to repay that debt. Now I do. Peter looked up with hope brightening his young face. Does that mean you will help me? Samuel looked at the letter, then at the brave boy who had risked everything to honor his father's memory. Son, we are going to make sure your father's sacrifice was not in vain. Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison are going to face justice for what they have done. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now to follow this epic Western adventure and discover how an old rancher and a determined boy plan to expose corruption that reaches the highest levels of territorial government. Outside, the Montana wind was beginning to pick up, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. But inside Samuel Hart's ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing. The kind that would either bring justice to Clearwater or destroy everyone brave enough to stand against corruption. Samuel spent the night reading Marshal McKenzie's letter, while Peter slept peacefully for the first time in days. The boy had collapsed from exhaustion once he realized he was finally safe, but even in sleep, he kept one hand protectively over the pocket where he had hidden copies of his father's evidence. The letter contained revelations that made Samuel's hands shake with rage. Marshal McKenzie had spent months investigating discrepancies in territorial welfare funds, and what he discovered was a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple embezzlement. Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison had created an elaborate system to steal money intended for war widows and orphan children. Families who applied for assistance were told their applications had been denied or lost in bureaucratic delays. Meanwhile, the funds meant for these desperate families were diverted to private accounts controlled by the corrupt officials. But the scheme was even more sinister than Samuel had initially realized. The letter revealed that when citizens became too persistent in their requests for help, they faced escalating intimidation tactics. First came official harassment through fake legal proceedings and property seizures. Then came threats against family members and mysterious accidents that served as warnings to others. Samuel turned to a section of the letter that made his blood run cold. Marshal McKenzie had documented the deaths of 6 people who had tried to expose the corruption. All had died in ways that appeared accidental, but followed a pattern that suggested systematic murder. The victims included a war widow named Sarah Collins, who had publicly complained about being denied assistance. She died in a house fire that witnesses said started unusually quickly. There was also a former soldier named James Murphy who had organized other veterans to demand an investigation into missing funds. He was found dead at the bottom of a cliff with injuries that suggested he had been pushed. Peter stirred on the sofa and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Did you finish reading it all, Mr. Hart?" Samuel set down the letter and looked at the boy with new understanding of the courage it had taken to carry such dangerous evidence. "Yes, son, I read every word. Your father was incredibly brave to gather all this information knowing the risks he faced." Peter stood and walked to where Samuel sat. "There is something else I need to tell you. Something that was not in the letter because my father did not have time to write it down." Samuel gave the boy his full attention. "The night before they killed him, my father told me that Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison were planning something big. Something that would let them steal even more money and get rid of anyone who might try to stop them. What kind of something?" Samuel asked. Peter's young face was grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. "They are going to burn down the Territorial Records Office in Helena. All the documents that prove how much money was supposed to go to widows and orphans will be destroyed. After that, there will be no way to prove they stole anything." Samuel felt his heart sink. If the official records were destroyed, it would be nearly impossible to prosecute Crawford and Harrison, even with Marshal McKenzie's evidence. The conspiracy was more sophisticated than he had imagined. "Peter, when is this supposed to happen?" Peter looked out the window at the morning sun. "My father said they were planning to do it this weekend when most of the government offices would be empty. That gives us maybe 3 days to stop them." Samuel stood and began pacing the room, his mind working through their limited options. The nearest federal authorities were in Helena, a 2-day ride through difficult mountain terrain. Even if they could reach the territorial capital in time, there was no guarantee that other officials were not also involved in the conspiracy. "Mr. Hart," Peter said quietly, "there is one more thing. My father wrote down the names of people he thought we could trust if we needed help." Peter pulled out another folded paper from his shirt pocket. "This is a list of honest men throughout the territory. My father said if anything happened to him, these were the only people who might be willing to stand up to Crawford and Harrison." Samuel studied the list, recognizing several names. Most were former military men who had served with honor during the Civil War. Others were businessmen and ranchers who had reputations for integrity. But they were scattered across hundreds of miles of territory. "Peter, we cannot possibly contact all these people in time to stop what Crawford and Harrison are planning," Samuel said. "We need to focus on the few who are close enough to help and who have the authority to take action." Samuel pointed to a name on the list. "Colonel William Hayes commands the Territorial Militia Unit based in Billings. He's only 1 day's ride from here, and he has the legal authority to make arrests when territorial law enforcement is compromised." Peter's eyes brightened with hope. "Will he believe us?" Samuel nodded. "Bill Hayes served under me during the war. He knows I would not make accusations like this without solid evidence. More importantly, he knew your father and respected him as an honest lawman." Peter stood up straighter, his young face showing determination. "When do we leave?" Samuel looked at the boy, who had already shown more courage than most adults. "Peter, this is going to be dangerous. Crawford and Harrison have already killed to protect their secrets. and they will not hesitate to kill again. Peter met Samuel's gaze steadily. "Mr. Hart, my father died because he believed that someone had to stand up for people who could not protect themselves. I am not going to let his sacrifice be for nothing." Samuel felt a surge of pride in this remarkable boy. "Very well, son. We leave within the hour. But first we need to make copies of your father's letter and hide them in different places. If something happens to us, the evidence must survive. Don't miss the next chapter of this epic Western adventure. Subscribe to our channel to follow this dangerous mission and discover whether Samuel and Peter can expose the conspiracy before Crawford and Harrison destroy the evidence forever. As Samuel and Peter prepared for their desperate ride to reach Colonel Hayes, they both understood that they were racing against time. The corrupt officials had spent years building their criminal empire, and they would do anything to protect it from exposure. But they had not counted on the determination of an old rancher who remembered his duty and a young boy who was willing to risk everything to honor his father's memory. The battle for justice was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether corruption or courage would triumph in the Montana Territory. The morning sun was just breaking over the Montana mountains as Samuel and Peter saddled their horses for the desperate ride to Billings. Samuel had chosen his two strongest horses, knowing that speed would be more important than comfort on this journey. Every hour they delayed gave Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison more time to destroy the evidence and eliminate any remaining witnesses. Peter had proven to be an excellent rider despite his young age. His father had taught him well, and he sat his horse with the confidence of someone who had grown up on the frontier. More importantly, he showed no fear about the dangerous mission they were undertaking. As they rode through the mountain passes, Samuel explained their strategy. "We will reach Colonel Hayes by evening if we push hard. Once he sees your father's evidence, he will have the authority to arrest Crawford and Harrison before they can destroy the records in Helena." Peter urged his horse faster as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "What if Colonel Hayes is not there when we arrive?" Samuel had considered this possibility. "Then we will have to ride on to Helena ourselves and try to warn the territorial authorities directly. It will be more dangerous, but we cannot let those records be destroyed." They had been riding for 3 hours when Peter spotted dust clouds on the trail behind them. "Mr. Hart, I think someone is following us." Samuel turned in his saddle and saw what Peter had noticed. At least 4 riders were approaching at a gallop, and they were gaining ground rapidly. Samuel recognized the riding style of men who were accustomed to pursuit and violence. "Those are Crawford's men," Samuel said grimly. "Somehow they discovered you were still alive and tracked us to my ranch." Peter's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "What do we do?" Samuel studied the terrain ahead, looking for defensive positions or escape routes. "There is a canyon about 2 miles ahead with good cover and multiple exits. If we can reach it before they catch us, we might be able to lose them in the rocks." The chase that followed tested both horses and riders to their limits. Samuel's animals were strong and well-rested, but their pursuers were riding fresh mounts and were clearly desperate to catch them. The gap between the two groups was slowly closing as they raced across the open prairie toward the canyon. Samuel could see the faces of their pursuers now and recognized Deputy Marshal Carson and 3 other men who worked for Mayor Crawford. All were armed, and their expressions showed they had no intention of taking prisoners. The canyon entrance appeared ahead like a gateway to salvation. Samuel and Peter plunged into the narrow passage with bullets whistling over their heads as Carson's men opened fire. The confined space of the canyon worked in their favor, making it difficult for their pursuers to maintain accurate aim while riding at full speed. "This way, Peter," Samuel called out as he guided his horse up a steep side trail that would take them to higher ground. From the ridgetop, they could see their enemies entering the canyon below, still trying to follow their tracks. Samuel had chosen their route carefully. The side trail led to a natural fortress of boulders where they could make a stand if necessary. More importantly, it offered an escape route that would take them directly to War Billings without having to backtrack. Peter followed Samuel into the rocks, his horse sure-footed despite the difficult terrain. Behind them, they could hear Carson and his men shouting as they tried to figure out which way their quarry had gone. Samuel dismounted and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. "Peter, I want you to stay with the horses and be ready to ride if I give the signal. Do not try to help me fight. Your job is to get that letter to Colonel Hayes no matter what happens." Peter started to protest, but Samuel cut him off with a look. "Son, your father trusted you with the most important mission of your life. Nothing matters more than completing it." The confrontation came when Carson and two of his men managed to track them to the boulder field. Samuel could see them approaching on foot, their weapons ready, as they searched for their hiding place. "Hart, we know you're up there," Carson called out. "Send down the boy and the letter, and we will let you live." Samuel's response was a rifle shot that sent Carson diving for cover behind a rock. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation and no surrender. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Samuel's superior position and marksmanship skills gave him a decisive advantage over men who were accustomed to intimidating unarmed civilians rather than fighting experienced soldiers. When the gunsmoke cleared, two of Carson's men were wounded, and the third was retreating down the canyon. Carson himself was pinned behind inadequate cover and clearly reconsidering his chances of success. Carson Samuel called out, "Your friends are gone, and you are outnumbered. Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." Carson's response was to fire wildly in Samuel's direction, but his shots went wide. Desperation had made him careless, and Samuel was able to end the confrontation with a single well-placed shot. The ride to Billings resumed with urgency, renewed by the knowledge that other enemies might be pursuing them. Samuel and Peter pushed their horses hard across the remaining miles, arriving at Colonel Hayes' headquarters just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. Colonel Hayes proved to be everything Samuel had hoped. He listened carefully to their story, examined Marshal McKenzie's letter, and immediately began organizing a response. Within 2 hours, a full company of territorial militia was riding toward Helena with orders to secure the records office and arrest Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison. The raids that followed were swift and decisive. Crawford and Harrison were caught in the act of preparing to burn the Territorial Records building. Their arrest, along with evidence from Marshal McKenzie's investigation, triggered the largest corruption scandal in Montana Territory's history. Subscribe now to our channel for more epic Western stories that celebrate the triumph of good over evil. The trials that followed exposed a network of corruption that had stolen thousands of dollars intended for war widows and orphaned children. Mayor Crawford and Judge Harrison were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, while dozens of their accomplices faced justice for their roles in the conspiracy. Peter McKenzie was adopted by Samuel Hart, who discovered that raising this remarkable boy gave new meaning to his later years. Peter grew up to become a territorial marshal himself, dedicating his life to the same principles of justice that had motivated his father. Samuel Hart never returned to his isolated existence. Instead, his ranch became a gathering place for honest men throughout the territory who were committed to fighting corruption wherever they found it. His reputation for integrity attracted visitors from across the West who needed help standing up to powerful interests. Marshal Thomas McKenzie was posthumously honored as a hero whose sacrifice had exposed one of the largest corruption scandals in territorial history. A monument was erected in Clearwater bearing his name and the inscription, "He died so that justice might live." The letter that had started it all was preserved in the territorial archives as a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are carried by the smallest hands. It proved that courage comes in all ages and that evil can only flourish when good people choose to remain silent. This Western story reminds us that true heroism often requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, and that justice sometimes depends on the willingness of individuals to risk everything for what is right.